Hello, everybody. It's Richard Bryant here from Cantian, Solutions Director. And with me today is Lindsay Brown, Technical Director. Lindsay, just say a quick hello.
Hi guys, welcome.
And we're here today to talk about multi-factor authentication, best practices actually for that on the IBM I as well. First of all, a little bit of housekeeping. So today's webinar is being streamed through your computer audio. We are going to be recording this and making the slides available for your own use. We'll be sending those links out after the session's recorded. And during the session, you will have opportunity to post any questions you like as and when they come up. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a type your message box. So please use that, and then we'll pick up those questions at the end and answer at that stage. Let's have a quick look at the agenda today. So we're here to talk about multi-factor authentication, what the issues are, what it is, what's its purpose, what it can help you do, what are the options for MFA these days, and what are the trade-offs around that, tips for some implementation, and particularly in the IBM I environment. We're going to start with the first topic then, which is what is MFA, and well, really, what is it not actually? So first of all, it's really about addressing the issue that we've got these days of passwords. They've been around for a very long time, and as security has become more of a focus, we've been concerned with making our systems more secure, and this has included improving the strength of passwords. However, there is a problem that we know the more complex we make our passwords, the more likely it is that the person writes them down or forgets them. And this can create a management issue for resetting passwords, spending the time doing that. It can even impact the user's productivity potentially. And we know statistically, and from the many security reports out there, that reliance on passwords alone is a risk in its own right. And in fact, on that note, there's been a couple of interesting changes of opinion, I suppose, or reports that have come out in the recent couple of years. One from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and even, believe it or not, the FBI, who no longer recommend complex passwords because they actually, in their opinion, introduce risk into the authentication process. I'll come on to that a little bit more. Equally, there are simple passwords problem, and I did include this perhaps to give us all a bit of a smile or cry as is appropriate. And this was actually from a 2018 audit that the state's Auditor General performed in 2018 on Western Australia. And you could see the results of this audit that the lackness of the passwords might be slightly amusing, but the potential consequences definitely aren't. When you've got over 1,500 people using password 123 as their password, and in one case, this is all, by the way, in the public domain. Don't worry, I'm not divulging anything confidential here. But in one case, the auditors were able to access one of the government agencies' network with full system admin privileges just by getting the password as Summer123. So we equally know that just having simple passwords to overcome the complexity is clearly not the solution either. So really the job of multi-factor authentication, MFA, is to add a layer on top of that existing username password framework. It creates the scenario then that requires the user to add another factor. So of the three factors we've got there, we've got the first one, which is something you know, the knowledge factor, which is usually a user ID or a password. Something you have or in your possession, the possession factor. These days, we're all very familiar, I think, with smartphones and multi-factor authentication on smartphones, your banking applications, things like that. Or the third item could be an influence factor. So your biometrics, fingerprint, iris scan, even voice recognition is coming into the scope of things these days. So we're looking at adding one of those last 2 points to start down the MFA route. So here's some simple examples, as if we needed reminding really, but of multi-factor. So we've got, in the first example, a laptop username and password, but then we have a mobile phone with a text message containing a code. Interestingly, I think Lindsay comes on to that. There are some issues around that type of authentication these days. Secondly, a token device like an RSA token used in combination with a username and password, or using your card as an example here to withdraw cash. You need your PIN as a second factor. The graphic on the right there is really just to reiterate then that the IBM I login with the username and password is not multi-factor. You need something else on top. So why is it required? Well, of course, in many industries, from a regulatory point of view, it isn't required at all. But what we have seen is, as a measure to improve security, particularly in these COVID times where we've got more and more people working from home, it is an excellent way of authenticating who is actually accessing our systems. Because we know that passwords alone are insufficient to protect the systems. The Verizon 2018 data breach investigations report said two-factor authentication, and I quote here, two-factor authentication phishing campaigns are still hugely effective. Employees make mistakes. Two-factor authentication can limit the damage that can be done. Two-factor, as in multi-factor, can limit the damage that can be done if credentials are lost or stolen. And in one of their more recent reports, they're estimating now over 80% of breaches are as a result of loss or stolen login credentials. So from a good practice point of view, it's becoming more and more expected, I think maybe is the best way of doing it, of putting it. But from a regulatory point of view, of course, there are some regulations out there. The most commonly common one we come across here in Australia is PCI DSS, where credit card information is being used. But as I mentioned, with more and more personal information being stored online, there is an expectation in a social context, an expectation that people's information will be protected properly. And part of that is making sure that login authentication is done better these days. There are also regulations that mention MFA, GDPR being one, and yes, that is relevant for many Australian organizations, SOX, SWIFT, etc. And it's interesting, as they're mentioned in those regulations, there's a general swell. What generally happens with these regulations is that after a period of time, they become more and more expected and eventually become part of those regulations. So there's a general tide then pushing people towards this multi-factor route, which is why really we decided to put this webinar on to give some of you a bit more background and maybe even some education around that. So why adopt it? Yes, we've got the regulations. I've already mentioned the risks around existing practices of using complex passwords, i.e. people writing them down. And that is one of the core risks that MFA will help you to address. It's also relatively simple to implement, and it can be very flexible in terms of the ways you can use it that make sense for your business. And also, users are generally familiar with it these days. You're not introducing a new paradigm that they've never seen before. We used to be doing this on our mobile phones, for instance. And then there's MFA working really well with BYOD, bring your own devices, or corporate devices, where you have people accessing your systems using those devices. They are more secure with MFA. And again, particularly with the enormous increase of people working from home, people are now logging into your systems from an unsecured location. They're not at their desks. The inherent temptation to write passwords down on a post-it note and stick it on the wall at home is even greater because it's not policed. So the risk of that goes up. MFA is an excellent way of making sure that only the appropriate person is able to log in, particularly when they leave their desk, and their teenage son, who just loves hacking, comes in and decides to have a bit of a go with the password that's up on the wall. Hopefully that doesn't happen to you guys or to me one day when my son gets old enough. But there we are. These are the sort of risks that we're trying to address. Lastly, organizations in Australia are increasingly aware of brand risk, particularly given the Privacy Act requirement to report data breaches. And you will see in larger enterprises these days that brand risk is part of project planning now. So what risk to the brand is there of a breach? And MFA helps to reduce and address that type of risk as well. So now I'm going to hand over to Lindsay, take us through the options that we've got for MFA implementation tips. Lindsay, take it away.
Great, thanks, Richard. All right, so before we get into MFA, just obviously to cover off what's already built into your iSeries or IBM I, and these go obviously a fair way towards trying to secure your machine, and obviously they should be implemented well, and trying to follow best practices. So if we just go through the list that's there in front of you, obviously security level, you want to probably have at least level 30 because you want to make sure that passwords are required. You then get things like the max sign values. So that's just to prevent brute force attacks from happening. So you have 3 or 5 attempts typically, and then the profile's disabled, and then you can't do anything no matter how much you try. Then there's various things you can do under the QPWD values, just to strengthen and add complexity to the passwords. Finally, you've got things like SSL, which allows you to use encryption internally, so at least you're not getting clear text stuff happening, which is always a good thing to have. Now, this is all about trying to get the best practice, and you've got IBM manuals, and there's plenty of stuff out there written by many people about how to do this kind of stuff. So IBM does try to help you get things, at least the basics in place. And now any of these values here we can mix and match, we can tie it up with MFA. Now, what I want to cover though with MFA is, well, we're talking about different steps here. So you got multi-step and one-step. So if you look at the multi-step, and some people are used to this, so you get you log in first and you put your user ID and password in, you get your pass, and then you go and get your passcode. After which point you get verified again, and then you can start doing whatever you want to do on the network or the machine or whatever it is. Now that's the multi-step. Now in the one-step authentication, you have to enter your ID, your password, and your code, and then it tells you pass or fail. Now it's considered to be more secure to have one step. It may be more frustrating for a user because they don't know where they got it wrong. Was it the password? Was it the passcode? However, the point of this is to slow down or to cause problems for hackers. So it is inconvenient for users that manage to fail because it doesn't tell them what it is, so they have to start all over each time. But it does actually slow down hackers and cause them to do extra work to try and get into your system. So it's a good way to try and do things, to have one-step authentication. Now, having said that, MFA, solutions, you can choose either or both. They're both valid. So it's good if the solution that you choose can do either, or as in it has both available to you. So options. So there's all these different options, and some people would be used to from either at work or VPNs or the bank or stuff like that. So you got all the stuff turning up on your smartphone. You got SMSs. You got your fobs, which are now becoming, the apps on the phone. You get the biometric devices, fingerprints, as you've seen even today on your phones. Some of these things react just with your fingerprint on the phone anyway. They then tie in with the authentication service that provides all this. That's Radius compatible, or these various things with RSA, Secure ID, Gemalto, and then becoming more popular, more aware, people's awareness is Microsoft and Google authenticators. Now, the thing to point out is that SMS is not considered to be truly secure. The NIST standards say, yes, you can use it, but they're not happy with it. Basically, SMSs can be essentially hacked or fooled into going to wrong places. So that's why it's not the ideal. Happens more in the US in my experience, or what I've been able to read and find out, than it does here. It's just that it seems to be quite easy to fool systems into going to the wrong place. Yeah, so what we're able to look at here, you want to be able to use the authentication services that you already may have in your business. So you want to be able to get a system that will already work with your Radius or your Secure ID or whatever. So you don't want to be going out and purchasing a new system just for the I-Series or to make the whole thing compliant. It means more cost, more management, more overhead. That's all just extra work for you guys, for your own IT departments. Now, key features to look for. So what we want to do here is, when we're looking for an MFA solution, obviously the first thing is, yes, integrate with the IBM iScreen. Big deal. Yep, that's a given. The ability to integrate with applications or processes. So think of this no longer as being just at the network level or at the machine level. This is to be able to say, okay, before you can get into payroll, I want you to authenticate. Before you can get into do SQL, you need to authenticate. So things that you may want to actually control quite tightly, in terms of changes, you've got your third-party vendors, you've got your developers, people accessing, doing changes, or things like that need to be changed, or people in bank scenarios, you're changing interest rates. So you want to have some of those areas tied down very tightly, and this is where you'd be wanting to bring in things like MFA. So it's not just at the network type layer or the machine access level, it can bring it right down to the application level. Now, with all this, you've got to be able to worry about things like, being able to tie into the different means of accessing your system. So when your systems get accessed, you can access it through not just green screen, but typically you've got ODBC, JDBC, you've got Java.net, you've got SQL Server. There's a host of things that might be attaching to your database, with or without your knowledge, hopefully with your knowledge. But you want to be able to force a factor authorization or authentication to make sure it is who they say it is. So you also want to be able to make sure you'd like it to be a compliant to some kind of standard, and better yet, to be certified. So by someone like RSA or NIST. Ideally, it also works with other IBM I access criteria, so software solutions, things that do, elevated authority, or, your exit points within the 400 or I-Series. So you really want to have something that's quite flexible in being able to work with all the points available of accessing databases on the I-Series. So some features. So authentication tips. So yeah, we've spoken about, there we go. So not only protecting the sign-on screen, but to protect application use. So like I said, you can have payroll, you need to have authentication to get into payroll, but everything else is fine. Or you have inquiries only, that's fine, but then you want to go into some additional stuff for doing changes. So you want to be able to get all these access points you spoke about, the exit points. So all the FTP, ODBC, SQL manager, and things like that within the I-Series. But you also want to be able to control, individuals or group profiles or whatever you like. So to be able to distinguish populations of users. That is, as Richard said, a bunch of users are now working from home. You've got people that may well be overseas. They could be in a coffee shop. They could be on a VPN. So you may want to define, based on IP address or location or time of day, when to initiate MFA. So you'd probably be less stringent on somebody in the office during work hours than you would be from somebody at a coffee shop, suddenly coming in from Bangkok or something like that. So you want to be able to control, make sure these are all valid things coming in. The other examples would be things like QSEC offer between business hours 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, but that's okay. But if QSecOff is trying to do something at 2 a.m. on a Sunday, well, then that's going to be something out of the norm, and you want him to authenticate. So that's how we can start adding things and add dynamic rules which try not to impact the users too much, but they are there to authenticate when they need to. We also want to make sure, as we said earlier, we can try and use your existing authentication methods. So whatever you've got in your current system, we want to, if we can, hook into those or work with your existing authenticators. We don't want to add more cost. And as described before, you can choose, 1 or 2 step authentication. So things to consider. So what happens if your authentication server is down? Now, is there a backup plan? What is your process? So these are all things that, it's great to have it all, but typically IT and DR, disaster failures, and what's your what if? How do you back out? What's going to happen if you can't get a hold of authentication servers? Do you allow people just to exit through? That kind of stuff. So it becomes quite a big question. So does the entire business stop if you don't have this? Do you have alternatives? How do you get through it all? How do you challenge, for QSecOff a type profile? So you have these high authority profiles. Are you going to add additional authentication to them? You're going to have 2 and even 3 level of authentication. Now what do you want to do with these high level profiles? How do you control all this stuff? Again, console. So do you consider someone on the console, HMC, is probably or more likely to be authorized because it's probably in a data center or in a highly secure area? Now, these are all these sort of questions you've got to work out. So where they're from, how they're accessing, what level of authority they have. And then the QMAX sign-on, we discussed that right at the beginning. So this is how do you control what's the effect of too many wrong things. And then something that's now emerging more and more is we know that the I series is very descriptive and tries to give a lot of information. In terms of security, more isn't necessarily so good. So one of the recommendations is to dumb down the messages. So they're all in these message files, which we know about. It's quite simple for us to change them, but to change it down from something to, instead of saying, your password's wrong or your passcode is wrong or your token's wrong, you just say access denied. This is about frustrating the hackers. So it's not so much now we're trying to keep our users good. We're trying to keep non-authorized people off and throw them off the scent and slow down any means they have of trying to get into your system. So that's another one of the recommendations these days. So look what else. Okay, so implementation tips. One of the things that you don't usually consider when you're buying software is the coding standard and behind it all. So obviously with security, it's like encryption. You need to have a standard. It needs to be, highly maintained, regulated, tested, and you make sure that it doesn't leak anywhere. Now, so it's hard for you or any of us to check what the coding is, but what we do want to find out is that we're not leaving traces behind. So again, with the 400 being so useful and friendly in logging everything and telling us everything, we have to actually be aware or cognizant to turn off, or the MFA process turns off all this trace information. We don't want to be able to have in a job log, the programs that were called, the parameters, or any kind of thing like that, or in the journals for that matter. So it's fine to say that, yes, MFA was initiated, so then stop writing out to the log, and then when you've got everything authenticated, right, now you can go back to the normal logging levels. So that's an important one to be aware of. Journals, well, we expect those to be protected, standard practice in most places, that most people can't get to them, but that's something obviously to be aware of. And then any changes to the MFA configuration. So people that are making changes obviously have a lot of control or the ability to change or control what's happening to your system or to alter how things are happening. So that needs to be strongly administered and audited, and probably even have potentially two sets of eyes looking at that. And that's something that a lot of them can do. Obviously, you want limited access to the MFA configuration, and some of these things you'll use the product to access it, to control itself. There we go. So supporting the 4 eyes principle. So sometimes what will happen is that you want to have supervisor override 4 eyes. So whether it's for changing the MFA rules for activating MFA, or whether it's for things like you want to have, supervisor override for accessing payroll data, you can do all that through the MFA. You can also, hopefully, you should be able to tie this in with your existing software for control, for things like even to audit or authorize commands for DFU, SQL, SST. So all these high risk things that allow access at a very detailed level to your machine. So you can control or at least verify who's going in to get this information or who's getting into your machine. So it's no longer just enough to be able to have someone's ID and password. Yep, we'll see in the last one there. So risk-based authentication policy. So again, what that means, we're talking about where the normal users, no problem. But if you have someone logging on that needs to have elevated authority for installing software, for making changes, for doing a DFU, or for even as it shows here, getting into the SST service tools, you want to be able to control that and have it, as it says, risk-based, time of day where it's not necessary during the day in the office, but outside of that, you want everything heavily logged and audited and controlled. To be able to tie in with your existing solutions, so even with the exit points, so anything that accesses your database or your IFS and things like that. So all these outside things that aren't directly controlled, typically from a security point of view, from accessing your machine. And by this I mean things like ODBC, your SQL servers, all your developers doing spreadsheet, Excel extracts and things like that. So all you want to make sure it's all the right stuff coming out. Yeah, so I think that's probably giving you a high level, and we'll give it back to Richard and he can advise how we can help you.
All right, Lindsay, thank you very much indeed. Now, just a reminder at this stage, if you have any questions you want to put to us, to Lindsay or I, then please, bottom right-hand corner, feel free, and we'll pick those up. I can see a couple there already. So how can we help? Well, some of you may already be aware. I know some of you are new to us. One of the things that we do is obviously operate within the security space, and particularly for the IBM I, we do that with a family of products called Assure Security, which covers a range of areas of security for the IBM I, from performing risk assessment on all areas of the machine through to specific areas such as data encryption, that's data at rest, data in motion, monitoring, whether it's database monitoring in terms of who's changing what, who's accessing data, or monitoring of security events with the IBM I, and then linking that up with your SIEMs, and then access control as well, controlling who's accessing what. And here's a sort of a diagram of how those different products that we've got in purple at the bottom hang together. And you'll see bottom left, Assure Multi-Factor Authentication is one of those modules. So the idea being, if you have a specific requirement, say around multi-factor, then we can talk to you, and there is a module specifically around that. But there's a roadmap further on, should you wish to be addressing other areas of security in future. So this product, like the multi-factor product, like all of them, is a standalone product available for evaluation, and we help you with all the planning, evaluation, implementation, rollout, training, etc., and ongoing support of that. So let us know if we can help you on that, and we can jump into action for you. So just looking at some questions then, got a couple in here, Lindsay. First of all, can we share the slides? Yes, no problem. This is being recorded. I mentioned that earlier. The recording and the slides will be made available to you. Next question here. Is it possible to use, this is one for you, Lindsay. Is it possible to use MFA for
Indeed,
IFS
we can. So we can use
access?
it to hook it into any access points for the IFS, so we can look at that and control it and get out the authentication or verify the user going in there, yes.
Okay, very good. Next question here. What's the hardware needed? Okay. I think right at the beginning we mentioned about the different authentication tools, which I suppose is part of the hardware picture. But Lindsay, do you want to cover that?
Basically, out the box, you don't need to purchase any additional hardware because it does have its own authentication engine built in. Or if you recall right back in the early days, we spoke about these different other services, Microsoft and RSA tokens and all that. So if you have existing systems, that's probably the best way to go. Otherwise, it's probably worthwhile then do an analysis of what you'd need for your entire environment and see if an MFA would work with that.
All right, super. That is pretty much it. I've realized we're end of the half hour. So unless there's any further questions, thank you everybody for your time, and stay safe. We'll get this recording and the slideshow out to you all. And
Thanks,
thank
Richard.
you very much
Thanks,
for your
everybody.
time. Thank you, Lindsay.
Bye.
All right, cheers, everybody.